Hi, this is Jean Rosenmeyer, and it's another episode of California Centric. I'm here with my co-host, Tim Vollmer.
Hey, hi.
And our special guest today is our executive director, Coyote Marin. Welcome, Coyote.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Today we're going to talk about our surveys that we have put in the field. We had one that was completed before the election, and there's another one that's in process right now. Coyote, tell us a little about how we chose the questions, how we structured the poll, and what we're hoping to achieve with it.
Yeah, so first I want to clarify that these are scientific polls, like the ones you read about in the newspaper. They're done by YouGov, which is um, a reputable polling agency. And so the results that we get accurately reflect California's population to within the margin of error, which in our case is a little less than 6%.
And I believe YouGov does quite a bit of polling. I think I've read many other polls that they have put in the field.
They also have a really good rating on 538.com.
So what are we doing with our poll? What makes ours different?
What makes ours different is that it's about California independence, which is a broad term. It can include peaceful negotiated secession, but it also includes just getting greater autonomy for California. So I don't know, in California, people will tell you like, oh, we have this one great thing. We have control over air quality standards. We can make our own air quality standards, and that's special for California. And that's true. But we're also very not special in that like 45% of our land in California is federally owned and controlled. We're like, in some ways, really less independent than the average state in the United States. And that's coupled with really reduced representation in the federal government. We're underrepresented in the national government, and we're less autonomous than most states in most areas. It's a quasi-colonial situation to be in, and I think most Californians don't really realize that, or they've learned that the hard way through the Trump administration.
So what's special about our poll?
Right. We try to be comprehensive in the sense of we cover all of what we think are realistic scenarios. So we don't ask about like, should we just declare independence and leave? Because like you can't do that with the world's largest military superpower. In our February 2024 poll, we basically asked people about independence scenarios, and then we asked them like, in what issue areas do you think Californians would be better off or worse off if we peacefully seceded from the US? So we asked about like water, immigration, guns, and I think 6 other areas. And in this one, we're asking policy questions. We're asking, should California do this in the scenario that we're in? We don't actually mention the Trump administration. Part of it is a tracking poll. It's like, did the election affect how Californians' views of independence? Of if we, and our question is, would you be better off? Not like, should we, which is a really complicated question, but just like, imagine, we worked it out and we became our own country. Would you be better off or worse off, like 10 years from now?
I really like that in the first poll, that was the way it was phrased, because, there's this hesitation and reservations people have, no matter how they feel, with the
Yeah.
thought of it, the thought of something so momentous or so impractical, maybe, or even scary. But you found a way to find what they really think and what they really feel. I was really surprised and encouraged, in a way, that so many people thought we would be better off, that that's what they feel.
Yeah, it was 58% of Californians. And so, people are saying like, well, it's a poll, it's random. The margin of error is 6%. So there's like a 90% chance that the real number is between 52% and 64%. So it's a clear majority is what we said. And then we asked people another question, which was a little different, which was, should California have special autonomous status within the US? And we gave examples of like Scotland is part of the UK, but it has its own devolved government. In Spain, there are some places that are just provinces and some that are autonomous regions that have more autonomy. And so it's like, well, we have this representation problem with the United States. California is very different from the rest of the United States. Like, what if we just, said, okay, fine, you're going to underrepresent us, but let us take care of ourselves. And that got 68%. So that's like in the two-thirds range. That's like,
Yeah.
that's like getting the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment kind of support. But I do want to be careful here. People can say, like, we would be better off, but we think, the United States would be worse off, and so we have to go save the United States. And like that's a real feeling. It's not a real thing we can do, honestly, because we're so underrepresented. But Californians do feel
Well,
responsible for
you
other
know,
Americans.
you said at the beginning that we have kind of a colonial relationship, and kind of a colonial relationship would be like that in a way that Californians would put the interest of the rest of the country, or what sort of the default country, which is the Eastern Seaboard, ahead of their own. And we have to kind of decolonize Californians to have them think about that. And I think the Trump administration's now, plural, is kind of doing that.
Yeah, and I think the model of colonialism is useful, but it's also important not to compare ourselves to like literal colonies like Puerto Rico, for example. That we're like we're in this halfway point, and so we're not like so bad off. And in some ways, we're better off than like most constituent units of countries in the fact that we can basically hold an election about any law or any constitutional amendment. We don't have to, if we want to do something where essentially we vote and we declare intentions toward independence, we're just allowed to do that. We don't have to get permission from the national government. And that's actually very rare.
You bring up a point that's interesting, and I think leads to a discussion about the second poll, which is, okay, yes, we can enact through direct democracy more than most places a law or legislation type stuff. But then it can be sort of curtailed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And don't you kind of ask uh, about that in the second poll?
Yeah, actually, one of our poll questions was here, I'm going to look it up, but this came out of a gun rights decision in Hawaii where the Supreme Court came out with this decision called Bruin that basically said the only gun laws that are allowed, the only restrictions on guns are the ones that have an analog in the 1700s or earlier. So, like, to prove that your gun law is valid, you can't just like show a public safety concern or something. You have to say, like, well, they were doing this at the time they passed the Second Amendment, so it fits within history. And it's like, it's a pretty ridiculous way to do law. Like, judges are actually not very good at being historians. But what the Hawaii court said is basically they quoted, you can quote things in decisions. They quoted The Wire, and they said, the thing about the old days, they're the old days. And that was the response to the court. And they were just like, the Supreme Court's decision is dumb and it doesn't apply here, basically.
So yeah, that's the last part.
Um,
That's good. Well,
yeah,
the
so
dumb,
the
it doesn't
question,
apply.
yeah, and so here's our question for the people we're polling. Should California's Supreme Court openly ridicule and bypass US Supreme Court decisions they believe deliberately misinterpret the US Constitution? So it's a pretty straightforward question.
Doesn't our Constitution have a provision that we defend our rights even if the U.S. doesn't? Isn't there something in the?
The California Constitution?
Yeah.
Okay, so the California Constitution does explicitly say that like the rights laid out in the California Constitution have their own like independent power separate from the US Constitution. And what that means in practice is, um, for example, freedom of the press in California. Like the US Constitution, First Amendment says freedom of the press. Our Constitution says freedom of the press. But ours has been interpreted to mean that newspapers are allowed to keep their sources confidential, whereas in the US, it has not. And you can actually, they can actually prosecute a journalist for keeping a source confidential when they want to find out who that source is so they can prosecute them. That's because the California courts get to interpret what the California Constitution's definition of free speech and freedom of press is. We were not locked into whatever the US Supreme Court determines.
Well, the reason why I like that question so much, and I think it should be emphasized, is that it's a perfect example of where California finds itself. I mean, the assumption here is a little bit that the Supreme Court has gone rogue.
I mean, if you take it from a political science perspective, you can actually point to like the polarization of the court. You can take the concurrence matrix and say like, we can use like anyone who like didn't even know what this court was making decisions on, if they just looked at who voted with who, they could be like, this court has factions, right? You can't do that with the California Supreme Court. So yeah, so there's like objective reasons to think that the US Supreme Court has gone rogue. It's not just a feeling. Actually, this question about the Supreme Court is a good window into the process of working with YouGov. The original question I wrote was much longer, and it mentioned the Hawaii case. And I think I tried to give like a constitutional argument for bypassing the Supreme Court. And YouGov came back and they were like, we're not going to tell you not to ask this question, but we don't think that anyone who doesn't know about the Hawaii Supreme Court case is going to care. And also, what if you just said it the simpler way? I mean, you have to do that, right? You're giving these questions to strangers who are like somewhat interested, maybe, in what you're asking them. And you want to make sure that everybody interprets the question the same way, because otherwise you don't know what your data means. So writing poll questions is like, it's really a form of poetry. You're really trying to use words to their maximum ability, and say things really concisely.
We work hard on these questions. We just don't come up with them. You tried to ground them in previous polls, not just our last one, but ones that have come before, so that the data can be compared, or it can at least be somewhat referential to what's come beforehand.
I think if you poll Californians about like, should California secede from the US, you get like 29% or something, which is like really different from like 58%, which is what our poll found. So when I was designing the questions for the first poll, I researched all the polls on California secession. There weren't any other like California autonomy polls, though. It just like didn't occur to anyone apparently. But I found the ones that said it was peaceful tended to get more support compared to other polls taken at the same time. And I was like, well, that's what I want, right? Like, I don't want California to declare independence and then to like get bombed by the United States military, right? Like, I want it to be something that we
interject that
yeah.
Independent California Institute, as an organization, does not want to secede amidst a civil war. We are nonviolent. I just want to put that in there for our audience.
Yeah, and it has been this from the beginning, and part of why our organization existed, it was to provide a counterpoint to organizations that were an organization, Yes California, that was much less responsible about that. That was like, we can just declare independence and figure it out later. Like, yeah, that just gives the U.S. an excuse to bomb you. It's not a route you want to go in this particular scenario. You want to do it through negotiation.
And there's plenty of precedent. The way Canada left the British Empire, the way Australia left the British Empire. We're not being radical here. We're trying to get back to basic democracy. And
there's tons of different directions we can move in all at the same time. You can pick an issue and make California more independent with respect to that issue in most cases.
I like to compare it with the EU, the European Union, and their motto is ever greater union. Our motto, I think, at ICI and those who are being responsible about this, is ever greater autonomy. I mean, just give us democracy. Let us have the same democratic rights that people in Rhode Island do, that people in Wyoming do.
So that's a good point to end this part of our discussion of the polling. We'll have a follow-up episode in which we carry on with some more specifics in the poll. Thanks for being here, Coyote and Tim.
See you guys soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Great seeing you.
Independent California Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit think tank. We educate the public and conduct research on greater self-governance for California.